So picture this. You're driving your car one day and you hear a loud grinding sound coming from the engine. Alarmed, you take the car to the shop and you find out that the transmission has broken right in half. The cost of a new car is $15,000, but the cost of a new transmission is only $1,000. Would it be cheaper to just get a new transmission or to buy a completely new car? The fact is that you can replace just one part of your car without having to build an entirely new one. They don't just make one transmission for each car, just like they don't make one steering wheel or one bumper. They make thousands that all work on the same car. This idea of having interchangeable parts, or parts that are exactly alike, may seem pretty simple now, but in 1801, it was a revolutionary idea. Okay? Before then, everything was made by hand. If one were to make a gun, the parts for that gun would be built by hand and would only fit that one certain gun. But Eli Whitney figured out that he could build the same gun 100 different times. So if one part of the gun breaks, you can just simply replace that part. Without being an expert gun maker or a gunsmith, an unskilled worker or someone that is not trained in a specific trade or skill could be taught how to create just one part of one tool over and over and over again. The worker doesn't have to know how to build a whole gun from scratch, just how to make one little part of a gun. This idea of interchangeable parts leads to something called mass production, or the production of goods in large quantities. So the goods that people love to use were no longer made entirely by hand, but by workers in factories. This plays into the idea of industry, which is economic activity dealing with the manufacture of goods in factories. What is a good, you ask? It's anything that was built from a raw material. What is a raw material, you ask? Rocks, metal, wood, dirt, cotton, all raw materials, okay? These raw materials go through a manufacturing process to become a good. So that wood is put into a factory and manufactured into a chair. Boom! That chair is a good. Iron ore found in the ground is melted and turned into a big sword. Boom! That sword is a good. Cotton is taken from a plant and it's taken to a factory and it's turned into fabric, and that fabric is turned into a shirt, and boom! That shirt is a good. So the process of taking that raw material into a factory and turning it into a good is called industry. It's the economic activity that deals with that, the industry. So Eli Whitney and his interchangeable parts lead into what we call the Industrial Revolution. The official definition is a social and economic reorganization that took place as machines replaced hand tools. Basically, if you want to run a factory that's powered by people, you have to pay them and give them time off and give them time to eat and sleep. But what doesn't need to eat and sleep are machines. Machines need no time off. Machines do not sleep or eat or poop like people do. They just work and they work and they work a lot better and a lot harder than human beings do. That's right. Machines got really popular in Great Britain, where people kind of figured out ways to generate power with streams or steam produced by burning like a ton of coal. God, we burned through that coal. So here's a little science lesson for you. As long as something is moving, okay, the energy created by that movement can be transferred. So let's say the movement of water in a stream can turn a giant wheel. The turning of that giant wheel can turn a series of gears, and those gears can make a machine that creates fabric from cotton. In the same way, coal can be used to boil large amounts of water and turn it into steam. This steam can be used to push a piston back and forth. And if you can get that piston moving back and forth, you can transfer that energy to do just about anything you want. You can even use it to power a train capable of crossing the entire continent of North America. You know what I'm saying? So this idea of industry was really popping in the northern United States. There were a lot of people that needed jobs, and really anyone could work in a factory. There was a lot of potential to make money with industry, specifically in the north. In the south, everyone farmed, and now there was farming in the north, but people pushed for like small farms to grow easy crops like corn or to raise livestock. So there was really no reason for these huge farms up north with tons of slaves and large production. That was mostly in the south. But in the south, cotton is king, people. Before Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin, it would take a slave one whole day to clean or get the seeds out of 1 pound of cotton. After the cotton gin, a worker could clean up to 50 pounds of cotton a day. If my math is correct, that's 50 times more cotton. So farmers needed more slaves than ever to tend to these giant cotton plantations. Cotton farming was by far the most profitable business in the country, and there was truly no need for any industry to happen in the South. It was just plantations and cotton, all day. So this industry brought a lot of money and a lot of jobs to the country, but it didn't really help mend the divide that America was seeing between the North and the South. Basically, America was becoming two different countries, united under one flag. The North was becoming very industrial, and the South was almost all farming or agriculture. In addition to this, it was really difficult to travel between states, specifically between the North and the South, and it was even harder to trade because states were still pretty independent from each other. We see this country really begin to divide between the industrial North and the agricultural South, and that's a problem. This giant metaphorical gap that's forming between the North and the South needs to be healed, and President John Madison presents a plan to Congress to do just that. He makes a plan that's basically like a giant Band-Aid used to heal the divided country into one great union once again. Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House at the time, called this plan the American System. The American system had three major points. One, to develop transportation systems throughout the country, including roads, railroads, and canals. Number two, to establish a protective tariff or a tax on imported goods. I'll explain that in a second. And three, to resurrect the national bank. I'll also explain that a little bit later. Those points are kind of confusing, but let me explain it this way. Clay says the American system would unite the nation's interests. An increasingly industrial North would produce the manufactured goods that farmers in the South would buy. Meanwhile, a predominantly agricultural South would produce most of the grain, meat, and cotton needed in the North. A national currency and improved transportation would facilitate the exchange of goods, and with each part of the country sustaining the other, Americans could finally be united and independent. Woo! So let's break it down a little bit. So the American system takes off with point number one, developing transportation. If people all over the country were going to do business with each other, they are going to have to communicate, and they're going to have to be able to travel to and from where they're doing business. Before railroads, it would take like 100 years to get from North Carolina up to Baltimore. But after the construction of the railroad, it only took like a few years. I'm just kidding, I don't know how long it would take. A lot shorter of a time. And in 1825, we see the first push for steam-powered trains to create a system of railroads across the North and the South and the Western United States. In addition to this, a highway system emerges. You heard of that? You heard of highways. To connect these different regions and cities by land. So the National Road began construction in 1811. Wow, roads! In addition to this, water was, and still is to this day, the best way to get really large quantities of goods from point A to point B. And because of this, the American system promoted the building of canals, or man-made waterways used for trade, all over America. The most famous of the era is the Erie Canal, which stretched all the way from New York City's Hudson River to Lake Erie, north of Ohio. There were over 3,000 miles of canals built by 1837. 3,000. Okay, now the other 2 points of the American system are kind of boring, but I'm gonna try to spice it up for you by wearing a sombrero. Okay, think of it like this. You can have goods that are made in America or goods that are imported from other countries. Here's how you remember that. Because the goods are brought from another country by boat and are put in a port. They're put in a port. They're imported. It's too big. With that being said, after the War of 1812, goods imported from Great Britain were like really cheap. Like way cheaper than goods that were made in America. But the American system proposed a tariff or a tax on imported goods. This would basically make the goods from other countries more expensive or around the same price as goods manufactured in America. And I don't know about you, but I'm always going to buy what's cheaper. So if I'm buying goods, I'm gonna be pissed that all of a sudden things I need are way more expensive. So a tariff doesn't necessarily sound like a great idea. However, all this that they're building, the roads and the canals and the railroads, they're not cheap. So the tariff is kind of a way to pay for those things. People in the industrial north are like, okay, this works for me. This is nice because, well, I'm making the goods. So if people are gonna buy them for a little more money, that works for me. But in the South, they're like, why are you doing this? You know, now everything I buy is more expensive. I'm mad. They were more like, I'm mad. Either way, the tariff of 1816 eventually passed and no one was really too mad about it. All is well. That's point number 2. Now, the last phase of the American system is the proposal of the second national bank. So there was one national bank of the United States that Hamilton, thought of, and then Jefferson was like, that bank. But this bank, the second national bank, was pretty much a home run. The government would charter or fund a bank for 20 years, and it would establish a national currency so that people in North Carolina could trade with people in New York, who could trade with people in Maine, who could trade with people in Georgia, and everyone has the same money. It's not confusing. You're not converting the money around. And this was just one more step to making trade between states and regions easier. Everyone loved this idea, and it was all good. So all of this change, the industrialization of the North, the booming cotton industry in the South, and the American system promoting new ways to unite the country made Americans feel pretty good about life. This era is called the era of good feeling because everyone was feeling good. Well, everyone except for the 20 million slaves that were forced to work non-stop under the threat of death and torture, but everyone except them is feeling pretty good. This idea that everyone is united under one nation is an idea called nationalism. Nationalism. When you think of the early 1800s, think of good feelings and nationalism. Everyone is united. But don't get used to it because in about 50 years, it's going to explode into the bloodiest war ever, the effects of which we are feeling heavily to this very day. But that is a story for another class. I thank you for joining me. I'm Mr. Hamstead, and don't forget to do your homework. Ugh, God.